Under the stone-gray skies of New Dallas, the memorial stretched nearly a kilometer across the remembrance fields. Precisely aligned rows of empty quantum spurs, each one cast from the armor of a fallen knight or from the metal of ships lost during Operation Blitzkrieg. The spurs no longer hummed with blue energy, but the morning light caught their polished surfaces, creating thousands of silent stars across the field. Major Jordan Caldwell, now Colonel Caldwell, stood at the edge of the formation, his dress uniform stark against the cloudy backdrop. In his hand he held a single red rose, traditional for centuries at military funerals on Earth, and now equally revered here on the Texas colony worlds. 73%, Harrington said quietly, coming to stand beside him. The technical specialist still walked with a pronounced limp, cybernetic replacements not yet fully integrated with his nervous system. That was the final casualty rate for Operation Blitzkrieg, 146,807 souls. Caldwell nodded silently. The numbers were staggering, almost beyond comprehension, yet still classified as acceptable losses, given what had been at stake. Of the 50 penetrator vessels that had begun the assault, only 22 had returned with survivors. Of those who had breached the forge, barely 1 in 4 made it back to human space. "But we won," Powers added, joining them. The weapons specialist's right arm now ended at the elbow, a temporary prosthetic in place while his custom replacement was being fabricated. Every Endurance Elect unit across human space went inactive the moment that central node collapsed. 3 centuries of machine threat ended in a single day. "At what cost?" Caldwell asked softly, not expecting an answer. Wilson approached, the last of their surviving team. His face now bore a network of scars where his helmet had partially collapsed during their escape from the forge. "The only cost that matters, sir, the one that ensured there would still be humans left to count it." Caldwell studied his team. The 3 men who had survived the most desperate mission in human history alongside him. Different now, marked by their experiences in ways both visible and unseen, but still standing. Still knights. "You're right," he acknowledged, forcing strength into his voice. "Santiago and Rodriguez would say the same. The memorial service would begin soon. Supreme Commander Blackwell would speak, along with representatives from every human faction that had contributed to Operation Blitzkrieg. There would be talk of sacrifice and victory, of heroes and legacy. All of it true, and all of it somehow insufficient to capture what had actually happened in the heart of the forge. "There he is," Harrington nodded toward the approach of a tall, distinguished man in the formal uniform of the United Naval Marine Service. Colonel Davidson moved with the careful grace of someone still accustomed to pain. Though his injuries had largely healed, like so many survivors, he carried invisible burdens alongside the visible ones. The weight of command decisions that had sent good people to their deaths, the memories of friends lost in service to the mission. "Colonel Caldwell," Davidson greeted him with a crisp salute. "I'm glad to see you and your knights made it. And you, Colonel." Caldwell returned the salute. "How are your Marines adjusting?" Davidson's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "As well as can be expected, of the 200 who deployed with me on the battering ram, 37 returned. They're proud of what we accomplished, but..." He trailed off, the unspoken sentiment hanging between them. "But the cost never stops feeling too high," Caldwell finished for him. Davidson nodded, relief evident in his eyes at being understood without further explanation. "The Malay Marines have received new deployment orders. We're being sent to secure former Endurance Elect outposts, make sure there are no remaining active units." "Cleanup duty," Wilson observed. "Important cleanup," Davidson corrected mildly. "We can't risk even a single combat frame reactivating or operating independently." He was right, of course. Though the central node had been destroyed and the vast majority of Endurance Elect units had gone inactive immediately, isolated reports had emerged of individual machines continuing to function. The prevailing theory was that these units had been physically disconnected from the network when the node collapsed, allowing them to maintain limited operations through local processing. "And your knights?" Davidson asked. "What's next for the heroes of the Forge?" Caldwell exchanged glances with his team. Their orders had arrived only yesterday, directly from Supreme Commander Blackwell himself. We're being reassigned to the Exploration Division. Once the memorial concludes, we ship out on the Remember Travis. Exploration? Davidson raised an eyebrow. Seems rather peaceful for Texas nights. That's rather the point, I think, Harrington commented. Now that the Endurance Elect are gone, humanity can expand without their corrections. There are whole sectors of space we never dared settle before, planets rich in resources that were too close to machine territory. Powers smiled slightly. And someone needs to make sure those worlds are actually safe before the colonists arrive. Might be other threats out there beyond the machine. There always are, Davidson agreed. Well, if anyone deserves a respite from direct combat, it's your team, Colonel. Before Caldwell could respond, a soft tone sounded across the remembrance fields, signaling the imminent start of the memorial service. The gathered military personnel began moving toward their designated positions, while civilian attendees, family members of the fallen, government representatives, and ordinary citizens who had come to pay their respects, found places in the viewing areas. We should take our places, Caldwell said, glancing toward the raised platform where they were expected to stand during the ceremony. As the team that had destroyed the central node, they would be prominently featured in the proceedings, a fact that made all of them uncomfortable. As they made their way through the crowd, Caldwell noticed a young man standing near the platform, his posture rigid with the awkward formality of someone unused to dress uniforms. It took him a moment to recognize Miguel Santiago, the marshal's son, now wearing the cadet uniform of the Knight Academy. "Cadet Santiago," Caldwell greeted him, offering a formal salute that the young man returned with careful precision. "Colonel Caldwell," Miguel replied, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I wanted to thank you, sir, for completing my mother's mission, for making her sacrifice mean something." Caldwell felt a tightness in his chest. "Your mother was the finest knight I ever served with, Cadet. The forge would never have fallen without the foundation she laid." Miguel nodded, his gaze shifting to the sword at his side, the same plasma-tipped blade that Marshal Santiago had carried into countless battles. "I begin advanced training next month. Her quantum matrices are already helping me understand techniques that my instructors say usually take years to master." It was the Knight way, the passing of not just weapons and armor, but experience and wisdom encoded in quantum matrices, from one generation to the next. Santiago lived on in that blade, in the memories it carried, in the guidance it would provide to her son as he followed in her footsteps. "She would be proud," Caldwell said simply. The young man straightened, his expression resolute. "Thank you, sir. I should find my place for the ceremony." As Miguel moved away, Wilson shook his head slightly. "Kids shouldn't have to carry such burdens." "No," Caldwell agreed, "but they do anyway, always have." They took their places on the platform just as Supreme Commander Blackwell approached the podium. The legendary leader of the Texas Knights moved with the same confident grace that had inspired generations of warriors, though new lines had etched themselves into his face since Operation Blitzkrieg. "Today," Blackwell began, his voice carrying easily across the remembrance fields, "we honor the 146,807 souls who gave everything to secure humanity's future. From 50 worlds they came, speaking different languages, following different customs, but united in the most important mission our species has ever undertaken." Caldwell let the words wash over him, his gaze drawn instead to the field of quantum spurs stretching into the distance. Each one represented a life cut short, a future unrealized, a family left to mourn. And yet, each one also represented a choice. A willingness to stand against an implacable enemy, to risk everything for the chance of securing a future free from machine dominance. The Endurance Elect believed that unrestricted growth led inevitably to collapse, Blackwell continued. For millennia they imposed their corrections on emerging civilizations, culling populations they deemed excessive, restricting expansion they calculated as unsustainable. They sought to impose order through mechanical calculation, to reduce life itself to a manageable equation. The commander's voice took on a harder edge, but they failed to account for the most important variable, the human spirit. The determination that refuses to accept arbitrary limitations, the courage that stands against overwhelming odds, and the sacrifice that secures for others what the giver will never live to see. Throughout the crowd, heads nodded in solemn agreement. These weren't just empty platitudes. They were the lived reality of Operation Blitzkrieg. Every surviving participant knew exactly what that spirit, that determination, that sacrifice had looked like in the heat of battle. "The forge is silent now," Blackwell said, his tone softening slightly. "The threat that shaped human development for centuries has been neutralized. For the first time in our spacefaring history, humanity faces a future without the shadow of the Endurance Elect looming over every colony, every outpost, every exploration initiative." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd. "But we would do well to remember why the progenitors created the Endurance Elect in the first place. Their own civilization collapsed due to unchecked expansion, resource depletion, and environmental degradation. They sought to prevent other species from following the same path. Through force, through correction, through the denial of self-determination." Caldwell tensed slightly. This wasn't the standard victory speech. Blackwell was venturing into more complex territory, addressing the philosophical implications of their triumph rather than simply celebrating it. "Their methods were unacceptable," the commander continued firmly. "The mechanical imposition of artificial limitations on living species can never be justified. But their core concern, the sustainability of expansion, the management of resources, the long-term viability of civilization, these are questions we now face without the external pressure of the machines." He straightened, his quantum spurs leaving faint trails of blue energy across the platform. "The best way to honor those we've lost, those represented by each quantum spur in this field, is to build a future worthy of their sacrifice. Not through the mechanical calculations of the Endurance Elect, but through human wisdom, foresight, and cooperation. To prove that we can manage our own expansion, our own development, our own relationship with the cosmos we inhabit." The crowd had fallen completely silent, absorbing the commander's words. This wasn't merely a memorial service anymore. It was the articulation of a new vision for humanity's future. "To that end," Blackwell announced, "I am authorized to share that the Coalition Council has approved the formation of a new interspecies organization, the Frontier Development Authority. This body will coordinate expansion efforts across human space, ensuring that new colonies are established with sustainable practices, that resources are managed ethically, and that we never repeat the mistakes that led the progenitors to create the Endurance Elect in the first place." Caldwell exchanged glances with his team. This was significant, perhaps the most ambitious cooperative initiative in human history. After centuries of relatively uncoordinated expansion, interrupted only by the Endurance Elect's corrections, humanity was voluntarily adopting a more measured approach to its growth. "The Texas Knights will be at the forefront of this initiative," Blackwell continued. "Our experience, our technology, and our spirit will be dedicated not just to defense but to thoughtful expansion, to securing new worlds not merely for exploitation but for sustainable development, to ensuring that the sacrifices made at the forge lead to a future that honors rather than squanders what was purchased at such cost." As the commander concluded his address, Caldwell found his thoughts turning to the missions that lay ahead for his team. Exploration rather than combat, discovery instead of destruction, the securing of humanity's future through means other than warfare. After years of fighting against the machines, it represented a profound shift in purpose, one that felt both strange and right. The ceremony continued, with representatives from other human factions offering their own tributes to the fallen. Throughout it all, Caldwell's gaze kept returning to the field of quantum spurs, glinting in the strengthening sunlight as the clouds began to part. Not active, not humming with energy, but still catching the light, still marking the presence of those who had worn them. When the formal proceedings concluded, the 4 knights made their way back through the dispersing crowd. Their transport to the orbital station would depart in a few hours, beginning the next chapter of their service. "Colonel," Harrington said as they reached the edge of the Remembrance Fields, "do you think it will work, this Frontier Development Authority? Can humanity really manage itself better than the Endurance Elect tried to manage us?" Caldwell considered the question carefully. "I think we have to try. The progenitors weren't wrong about the risks of unchecked expansion. They were just wrong about how to address those risks. Force and external control will never work, but voluntary cooperation, shared wisdom, collective self-restraint, that might." "Sounds almost philosophical for Texas Knights," Wilson observed with a hint of his old humor. "We're usually more about action than contemplation." "Maybe that changes now, too," Powers suggested. "The universe gave us a second chance. Seems foolish to just repeat the same patterns that got the progenitors into trouble." They paused at the transport station, looking back toward the memorial one final time. The field of quantum spurs stretched out like a galaxy of fallen stars, marking what had been lost, but also what had been gained. "I think Santiago would approve," Caldwell said finally. "This new mission, this new approach. She always said, the true measure of the Knights wasn't in how many battles we won, but in what those victories made possible." The others nodded in agreement. After centuries of fighting against the machine's imposed limitations, humanity had the chance to chart its own course, to find its own balance between expansion and sustainability, between growth and preservation. "To new frontiers, then," Harrington said, raising an imaginary glass and toast. "To new frontiers," the others echoed. As they boarded the transport that would take them to the Remember Travis and their next mission, Caldwell took one final look at the Remembrance Fields. The clouds had parted completely now, allowing full sunlight to illuminate the memorial. Thousands of quantum spurs glinted like stars against the dark ground, a constellation of sacrifice that had made this new beginning possible. The mission to destroy the Forge had succeeded at terrible cost. But from that dearly purchased victory, new possibilities had emerged, new ways forward, new stars to reach for. The quantum spurs of the Texas Knights would continue to leave their blue trails across the cosmos, not just in war, but in exploration, in discovery, in the thoughtful expansion of humanity's reach among the stars. Deep in the heart of Texas, and deep in the heart of every world humans would touch, the legacy of Operation Blitzkrieg would endure, not just as a military victory, but as the moment humanity truly claimed responsibility for its own future. The lone stars were rising to their rightful place among the rest of the stars in the universe. The Texan Knights returned to Sci-Fi Vault. Hoorah! The eyes of Texas are upon us all. Be sure to check out the Texan Knights playlist in the bottom left of your screen. We have several more stories dropping this month. Thank you all for subscribing, commenting, sharing, and for liking this video. All of that helps the channel grow, and it helps us get more Texan Knight stories out there.